The sound of 1991 still lingers, neon lights flashing above crowded dance floors, cassette tapes spinning in boom boxes, and a rhythm that seemed to promise forever. Songs like Summertime and Gonna Make You Sweat ruled the airwaves, but somewhere in that golden mix, another voice rose and disappeared almost as quickly, the sound of Damian Dame. They weren't just another R&B act. They were the very first artists signed to LaFace Records, blending soul, hip-hop, and heartbreak into something new. Yet fame, as it often does, came with silence trailing close behind. How does a duo that once defined an era become a name most people barely remember? Let's get into their story right now. Grab a warm drink, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the music, before the lights, there were two souls chasing the same dream from opposite sides of America. Deah Dame was born Deah Harriet on the 20th of September 1958 in Houston, Texas, and raised under the warm California sun in San Jose. Her father remembered that even as a baby, she hummed in perfect pitch. Music wasn't just something she loved, it was something that lived inside her. Growing up, she was drawn to the voices of Tina Marie and Denise Williams, women who made emotion sound effortless. She sang in the church choir, where her voice stood out not because it was the loudest, but because it carried feeling, like it was telling a secret. By 18, she was touring with her sister and brother-in-law's band, performing in small clubs across California. The pay was small, but the applause was real, and that was all she needed. A few years later, she caught the attention of Geffen Records and released a self-titled album in 1983. The songs Hug Me, Squeeze Me, and her cover of Prince's Got a Broken Heart Again showed the world a confident young woman with a voice that could move between tenderness and strength. Though her record only reached No. 62 on the R&B charts, it was enough to prove that she belonged. But the mid-80s were a hard time for solo female singers trying to break through. Labels were shifting toward new sounds, and competition was fierce. Deah's deal with Geffen faded quietly, and like many artists before her, she found herself back in Los Angeles, working behind the scenes, doing background vocals, singing demos, helping others chase the dreams she still held close. It was there she met a young producer and songwriter named Kenneth Babyface Edmonds, who was then taking a break from his own group, The Deal. Babyface loved her tone, that smoky mix of sweetness and soul, and invited her to sing background vocals on his first solo album, Lovers, 1986. The collaboration led to more opportunities, sessions with Karen, White, Pebbles, and Shalimar. Deah's voice became part of the foundation of late 80s R&B, even if most people never knew her name. At the same time, over 2,000 miles away in Battle Creek, Michigan, a boy named Damian was finding his rhythm. Born Damian Dame D, on the 13th of September 1966, he taught himself piano, drums, and guitar before he was 10. While other kids played outside, Damian sat for hours, tapping rhythms on tabletops, replaying songs by Michael Jackson and Prince. His mother once said he could turn anything, a pencil, a spoon, a desk, into an instrument. By 16, he was performing in small clubs around his hometown. He didn't drink or party much. He was there for the music. People remembered his quiet confidence, the way he closed his eyes when he played, lost in a sound only he could hear. Eventually, like so many dreamers from small towns, he packed up and moved to Los Angeles. In L.A., Damian joined a group called Shy Boy and later started his own production company, Kazoo. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing the perfect song. By the late 1980s, he was producing for local artists and waiting for something or someone that would push his creativity further. That moment came when a mutual friend handed him a demo tape. It was Deah Dame. From the first note, Damian was captivated. Her voice wasn't just technically good, it had heart. He reached out immediately, and within weeks, they were in the studio together. At first, Damian planned to produce her project, but as they worked, Deah encouraged him to step behind the microphone too. She heard something in him, a texture, a warmth that balanced her tone perfectly. For 3 months straight, they spent nearly every day in the studio, writing, arranging, experimenting. Damian would layer beats, while Deah built melodies around them. It was a creative partnership built on respect and intuition. There was no ego, just music. When the demo was done, They started sending it to record labels, hoping someone would listen. Around that time, Babyface and L.A. Reid were forming their new label, LaFace Records, with Clive Davis at Arista. They were looking for artists who could define the sound of a new decade R&B with a modern, streetwise edge. When they heard Damian and Deah's demo, they knew it was something special. For Deah, it felt like life coming full circle from singing background for Babyface to becoming one of his label's first signed acts. For Damian, it was validation that years of quiet work and faith were finally paying off. Two different lives, two different beginnings, one shared destiny. Before long, the world would know their names. But for now, they were just two artists, sitting in a dim studio, chasing the sound of something new, something honest. When Damian and Deah started recording together, there was no fame, no label, no promises, just two artists sitting in a small Los Angeles studio, surrounded by cables, keyboards, and dreams. They didn't even know what to call themselves yet. What they knew was that their sound was something different, emotional, rhythmic, and alive. Deah was the experienced one. She had seen the industry from the inside, the deals, the smiles, the disappointments. She had already learned that talent alone wasn't enough. Damian, on the other hand, brought a kind of purity, a hunger untouched by the business. He was all heart and rhythm. Together, they found balance. Their early sessions were long and unglamorous. They'd arrive before noon, eat fast food between takes, and sometimes stay until dawn, chasing the perfect mix. Damian would experiment with drum machines and layered harmonies, while Deah crafted melodies that wrapped around his ideas like silk. There was no producer giving directions, no record executive to please, just instinct and connection. They recorded 4 songs for their first demo. It wasn't meant to impress the world, only to capture what they felt. One track in particular, a smooth blend of hip-hop beats and soulful harmonies, would later evolve into Exclusivity. The chemistry was immediate, and so was the respect. Deah often said that working with Damian reminded her why she fell in love with music in the first place. When the demo was finished, a mutual friend slipped a copy to Kenneth Babyface Edmonds, who was then preparing to launch a new record label with his business partner, Antonio L.A. Reid. The timing couldn't have been better. LaFace Records, as they would call it, was envisioned as a home for artists who could define the new sound of R&B, one that was young, urban, and modern, but still rooted in soul. Babyface had always believed in Deah's talent. He remembered her voice from the Lovers album, and from countless late-night sessions when she quietly made other singers sound better. When he heard her again, this time paired with Damian, it wasn't nostalgia that struck him, it was surprise. This was something new. By early 1991, Babyface and L.A. Reid invited them to Atlanta for a meeting. Damian and Deah were nervous, but excited. They didn't have a manager or stylist, just their music and a shared sense of purpose. When they entered the LaFace offices, they were greeted with warmth. Reid asked them to play one song, Exclusivity. As soon as the chorus hit, the room filled with smiles. "That's it," Babyface said. "That's the sound." In that moment, Damian Dame became the first act ever signed to LaFace Records. It was history in the making, though none of them realized it yet. For Damian, it felt like all the years of self-teaching and small-town gigs had led to this room. For Deah, it was a second chance, a way to turn the quiet heartbreaks of her career into something lasting. They spent the next several months refining their songs with Babyface's production team, blending their raw sound with LaFace's polished R&B aesthetic. The label wanted a debut single that felt both modern and timeless, something people could dance to, but also feel. And so, on the 15th of April 1991, Exclusivity was released to radio. The song was infectious, bright, rhythmic, unapologetically cool. It moved fast up the charts, across nightclubs, into cars cruising down summer streets. 2 weeks later, it reached #1 on the US R&B chart and broke into the Billboard Hot 100. For two artists who had once worked in obscurity, it was validation. Their sound, that delicate balance of groove and grace, had found its place. But what they didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. The music would grow, the fame would rise, and so would the pressure. When Exclusivity hit #1 on the R&B charts, it wasn't just a win, it was history. Damian Dame had become the very first act to carry the LaFace banner, the label that would soon launch legends. For a moment, their sound defined what the new decade of R&B could be: sharp, emotional, and full of rhythm. Their self-titled debut album, Damian Dame, followed on the 14th of May 1991. It didn't break into the Billboard 200, but among R&B fans, it became something of a cult classic. Songs like Right Down to It and Got to Learn the Rhythm stood out, full of chemistry and confidence. Right Down to It climbed to number 2 on the R&B charts, staying there for 21 weeks, a quiet statement of staying power in an industry that moved fast. Behind every note was the unmistakable balance between Damian's grounded, rhythmic tone and Deah's smooth, soaring delivery. Together, they created something rare: music that was both sensual and sincere. Inside LaFace Records, there was excitement. The label was still young, and Damian Dame's success proved it could compete with major players. They were invited to events, studio sessions, and showcases. Their peers, TLC, Toni Braxton, and the newly signed Usher, looked up to them. After all, Damian and Deah had been there first. During those early LaFace years, collaboration came naturally. T-Boz and Left Eye from TLC lent vocals to Damian Dame's track 60 Seconds. The conclusion: a young Chili, not yet part of TLC, worked as one of their dancers. She would later say that performing with Damian Dame opened the door to her own journey with Pebbles and the group that would change her life. In those moments, Damian and Deah were more than artists. They were mentors, the quiet anchors of a label that would soon dominate R&B. Still, fame can be a double-edged light. For every applause, there was pressure. Their album, though respected, hadn't sold as much as expected. Radio stations wanted more singles, the label wanted new hits, and the industry was shifting toward youth and image. Deah remained calm, graceful under stress. She had already survived one career's rise and fall, and knew that staying true to the music was all that mattered. Damian, younger and more idealistic, felt the weight more deeply. He had entered the business for art, not competition, and now, the machinery of fame began to feel suffocating. Friends remembered seeing him grow quieter during that time. He started writing more personal material songs about loss, identity, and the cost of ambition. He still smiled for interviews, but those close to him said there was something reflective in his eyes, as if he already sensed how fragile success could be. By 1992, the duo had recorded a new track for the Boomerang soundtrack, Reversal of a Dog, featuring TLC, Toni Braxton, and the Highland Place Mobsters. It was their final collaboration with the label, an anthem filled with playful irony and sharp rhythm. On the surface, it was just another LaFace release, but to Damian and Deah, it was a sign of change. Behind closed doors, the label was shifting focus. TLC was becoming a phenomenon. Toni Braxton was about to win Grammys. LaFace was exploding into mainstream success, and the duo that had helped start it all quietly faded into the background. For Damian and Deah, that transition was bittersweet. They were proud to see the label thrive, yet there was pain in being forgotten so soon. They had opened the door but were left standing in the hallway. Still, they didn't give up. They talked about new music, about taking control of their next project, one that would show who they truly were beyond the label's expectations. They had plans to write, produce, and release their second album together. They believed there was still time. But the story of Damian Dame wasn't meant to follow the usual path of fame. Their journey, so full of promise, was about to turn toward heartbreak. For a short moment in 1991, Damian Dame stood exactly where every young artist dreams of being on the edge of stardom. The lights were bright, the music was theirs, and the sound of their voices filled clubs and radios across America. They weren't just performers, they were symbols of what was coming, a new sound of R&B that merged street rhythm with emotional storytelling. Everywhere they went, people recognized their energy. Deah, tall and radiant, carried herself with quiet confidence. Damian, with his magnetic presence and soft-spoken charm, made people listen even before he sang. When they performed Exclusivity live, their chemistry was undeniable, the kind of spark that couldn't be taught or rehearsed. It was real. Audiences could feel that connection. They weren't watching two entertainers, they were watching a partnership built on trust and harmony. It wasn't just about the music. It was about the way Deah's eyes met Damian's when they sang a shared line, or the way he smiled after a verse as if to say, "We made it." The success of Exclusivity opened doors. Television appearances, award shows, and small tours followed. Their performances were polished yet full of emotion, with Deah often stealing the stage with her effortless poise. She carried a warmth that drew people in part big sister, part star. Damian, meanwhile, was learning to navigate fame. For someone who had spent most of his life behind the instruments, standing in front of thousands was both thrilling and surreal. LaFace Records promoted them as the label's foundation, the first proof that Babyface and L.A. Reid could turn their vision into reality. And they weren't wrong. Within months, LaFace was on every industry radar. TLC was rising fast, Toni Braxton was being developed, and the label's influence was spreading across the charts. But behind all that success stood Damian and Deah, the duo who had lit the first spark. They recorded radio interviews and photo shoots, often talking about how grateful they were. Damian would say, "We just want to make real music, something that'll still mean something years from now." Deah would smile and add, "We're just getting started." The irony, of course, was that they didn't know how brief that start would be. During this time, Atlanta's music scene was transforming. The city, once known for funk and gospel, was becoming the capital of 90 seconds R&B and hip-hop. Damian Dame were right there at the heart of it, recording at LaFace Studios, collaborating with producers, and helping shape what would become the Atlanta sound. Inside the label, everyone knew they were talented. Babyface trusted Deah's ear for harmonies. L.A. Reid often asked Damian for input on rhythm arrangements. They weren't just artists, they were part of the creative engine. There's a story told by one of the studio engineers who worked on their sessions. He said, "When Damian and Deah were in the room, it didn't feel like work. It felt like watching music being born. That was their gift. They brought soul into every corner of the studio. At their peak, they were recording constantly. Deah had plans to mentor younger singers. Damian was already talking about producing other artists under their own imprint someday. They saw a future not just as performers, but as creators. By the summer of 1992, their music had become part of the cultural rhythm. Their name might not have been in every magazine, but their sound lived in every club playlist. People danced to them without even realizing they were helping define a generation. In many ways, that was their victory. They didn't need to be the loudest stars. Their light came from the quiet truth of what they created, a sound both timeless and tender. For Damian and Deah, the dream had finally become real. The music they once made in a small, crowded studio now echoed through speakers across the country. And for a moment, just long enough to believe it might last, everything they had worked for felt worth it. Success, in Hollywood and in music, often hides its own shadow. For Damian and Deah, that shadow came quietly, not in one moment, but through the slow realization that fame wasn't what they imagined it to be. By late 1992, LaFace Records had become a powerhouse. TLC was climbing the charts, Toni Braxton was on the verge of stardom, and Babyface was producing for Whitney Houston and Boyz II Men. The label was expanding fast, its energy focused on new, marketable acts. Somewhere in the middle of that storm, Damian Dame began to disappear from the spotlight they had helped create. Their names weren't on the billboards anymore. Their calls went unanswered. They were the first to sign, yet the first to be forgotten. Those close to them said that Damian felt the change most deeply. He was proud of what LaFace was becoming, but he couldn't shake the sense that he and Deah had been left behind. The music they helped build was everywhere, just not with their names on it. He had written hooks, ideas, and melodies for other artists, but the credits often went elsewhere. It was the kind of quiet pain only those inside the industry understand. Deah tried to keep his spirit up. She had been through her own share of heartbreak in the business, and knew that bitterness could destroy what talent had built. "Let's focus on what we can control," she told him. The music. And they did. They began planning their second album, one that would speak more honestly about love, loss, and resilience. But the momentum was gone. The label was too busy, the budgets too tight. Promises were made, then postponed. In the background, small tensions began to grow. Friends recalled how meetings with executives felt different, colder, more formal. There were whispers about unfair contracts, unpaid royalties, and creative disagreements. Other LaFace artists, including TLC and Toni Braxton, would later face their own battles over money. But for Damian and Deah, there was no platform left to fight from. They had no scandal, no controversy, just silence. And in the music industry, silence can be louder than failure. Still, there were glimpses of hope. In 1994, they were preparing to return to the studio for that long-delayed second album. Damian had been writing new material music that reflected the maturity and heartbreak of the past few years. Deah was excited, more than she had been in a long time. "We've got stories to tell," she said to a friend. "Real ones this time." But before they could record a single note, tragedy struck. On the 27th of June 1994, Deah Dame was killed in a car accident in Atlanta, Georgia, the same city where she had once found her greatest chance. The news spread quietly, without headlines, without statements. The label said little, and the music industry barely noticed. To Damian, it was more than loss. It was the breaking of something sacred. Deah had been his partner, his creative mirror, his balance. Without her, the music felt hollow. He tried to continue, recording a solo album in her memory. He called it Damian 1996. It wasn't released through LaFace, but through a smaller label. On the dedication page, he wrote only a few words, "For Deah, always." It was released in June 1996. Days later, on the same date Deah had died 2 years earlier, Damian passed away from colon cancer. He was only 29. 2 lives, linked by music, gone too soon. Their deaths left a silence that no one quite knew how to fill. LaFace moved on. The world moved on. And the songs that once filled dance floors became quiet echoes of what might have been. But somewhere, in those old recordings, you can still hear it, that spark, that promise, that sound of 2 people who believed in each other more than fame ever could. That was the real heartbeat of Damian Dame. The night Deah Dame died, Atlanta's streets were quiet. It was the 27th of June, 1994, the kind of humid southern evening when the air feels heavy with sound and memory. She had left a friend's house, and what happened next would end one of R&B's most promising stories before it truly began. Reports of the accident were brief and confusing. Some said she had been driving home. Others whispered she was on a moped. What everyone agreed on was that the crash was brutal, sudden, and final. She was only 35. There was no press conference, no major tribute. The same industry that once called her voice a revelation barely spoke her name. The following days came and went with silence. Fans who had danced to Exclusivity and Right Down to It never knew that one half of the duo that gave them those songs was gone. For Damian, the news was devastating. Friends later said he didn't speak for days. Deah had been his creative partner, but also something deeper, the person who believed in his voice when no one else did. She was the one who had convinced him to sing instead of hiding behind the studio console. Losing her was like losing the sound itself. He withdrew from the spotlight completely. LaFace Records had moved on to bigger acts, and there was no one left to protect the small space Damian and Deah had once occupied. He spent the next 2 years quietly writing and producing, often working alone. People who saw him said he seemed calm, almost peaceful, but there was a sadness behind his eyes that never left. In 1996, he finally returned to the studio to record a solo project. He didn't have the backing of LaFace anymore, but he didn't care. This time, it wasn't about business or success. It was about closure. He named the album Damian 1996, a simple title for a man who had stopped chasing fame. He dedicated it to Deah. The songs were intimate, stripped down, and honest, a mix of gospel, funk, and slow-burning R&B that felt more like a conversation than a performance. There were moments where it sounded as though he was singing directly to her, asking questions that would never be answered. Only a few close friends knew how sick he was at the time. Damian had been diagnosed with colon cancer but kept it quiet, refusing to let illness define his final act. He worked until the last possible moment, finishing the album even as his body grew weak. On the 27th of June 1996, exactly 2 years after Deah's death, Damian passed away. The symmetry of that date felt almost too perfect, too cruel, as if fate itself had chosen to close their story on the same page. When the news broke, there were no headlines, no retrospectives, just another quiet passing in a loud industry. But for those who knew them, the musicians, engineers, and friends who had watched them build something from nothing. The loss cut deep. Two souls who had once given everything to their art had left behind only echoes and memories. Their music, once filled with life and rhythm, now carried a haunting silence. After Damian's passing, there was no farewell concert, no tribute special, no official statement from the label that had once promised them the world. The silence was absolute. In an industry built on sound, perhaps silence was the cruelest response of all. LaFace Records moved forward new stars, new albums, new awards. The machine kept turning, and the people who had started it all became footnotes in their own story. There were brief mentions in interviews, an occasional reference to the first LaFace act, but nothing more. For years, their names slipped through the cracks of memory. Damian Dame, once a promise of the future, became an echo of the past. Their records faded from radio rotation, their videos vanished from music television, and their legacy rested quietly in the hearts of those few who still remembered. But among those who had worked with them, the loss lingered. Studio engineers spoke about how different the room felt without them. One recalled, "They didn't just make music, they made people believe in music again." The quiet that followed their deaths was not just the absence of sound, it was the absence of recognition. There was no award, no moment of public reflection. It felt as though Hollywood, and even the R&B world, had chosen to look away. Yet time has a way of returning to what's true. In the early 2000s, a new generation of R&B fans began rediscovering Right Down to It, calling it a lost gem, one of those songs that never left the soul, even when it left the charts. Singer Kenny Lattimore covered it in 2001, honoring Damian's original, but even he admitted, "You can't capture that same magic. It's theirs." On fan message boards and quiet corners of the internet, people began to share memories, grainy footage, vinyl rips, and stories of hearing Damian Dame for the first time. For them, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was justice. Those who knew Damian and Deah personally remembered them not as tragic figures, but as artists who gave more than they received. Deah was remembered for her generosity, the way she guided younger singers, her patience in the studio, her laughter that broke tension during long sessions. Damian was remembered for his curiosity, his love for melody, his quiet humility, and the way he saw music as something sacred. There's a story told by one of Damian's closest friends. After Deah died, Damian once said, "We did what we were meant to do. Maybe that's enough." Those words now feel like the truth that defines their legacy. Their deaths might have closed the chapter, but their music kept the story breathing. In every replay of Exclusivity, every note of Right Down to It, you can still feel their presence, two voices blending, two spirits still in conversation. Fame can forget, history can overlook. But music, real music, has a way of surviving the silence. And so, long after the lights dimmed, Damian Dame's sound remains a quiet heartbeat in the history of R&B, pulsing softly for anyone willing to listen. Legends are not always measured by how long they shined, but by how deeply their light touched those who came after. For Damian Dame, that light still flickers not in headlines or Hall of Fame plaques, but in the subtle DNA of modern R&B. Their influence runs quietly through the music that followed. The way male and female vocals intertwined in songs like Exclusivity or Right Down to It laid the foundation for what became a signature of early 90 seconds R&B, harmony between strength and softness, rhythm and emotion. The success of duos and groups that came after them, from TLC to Ashanti and Ja Rule's collaborations years later, all carried echoes of that same chemistry. Even without mainstream recognition, musicians noticed. Producers from the Atlanta scene, those who had worked at LaFace and beyond, often mentioned that Damian Dame's sound helped shape what would later be called the Atlanta groove. It was smooth but urban, layered but simple enough to dance to. It was the bridge between the polished soul of the 80 seconds and the rhythmic confidence of the 90 seconds. Deah's vocal arrangements, too, became quietly influential. Her harmonies, crafted in the background of Babyface's productions, helped define the sound of the label even after she was gone. Singers like Toni Braxton, Faith Evans, and Monica carried that same emotional phrasing, the mix of vulnerability and control that Deah had once delivered effortlessly. And Damian, the quiet architect, left his fingerprints everywhere. His blend of electronic textures and live instrumentation became part of LaFace's production identity. It's said that some of his early rhythm programming techniques were studied by young producers who later built Atlanta's R&B empire. He may not have lived to see it, but the music he helped invent became the sound of a generation. Beyond the studio, their story represented something larger, a reminder of how easily the industry can overlook the very artists who paved the way. In every conversation about LaFace's legacy, there's a line that deserves to be spoken louder. Damian Dame were the first. They took the risk before the label had a name, before the success of TLC, Toni Braxton, or Usher made it a household brand. Without their leap of faith, the history of 90 Seconds R&B might have been written differently. In the years since their passing, small tributes have surfaced: DJs spinning Exclusivity during throwback sets, R&B podcasts revisiting their album, and younger musicians discovering them through old vinyl collections. There's even a quiet reverence among collectors who see their debut record not as a forgotten release, but as a cornerstone of an era when music still came from the heart. To those who take the time to listen, the sound still feels fresh. The groove is unmistakably early. 90 seconds, but the soul feels timeless. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not fame, not awards, but resonance, the way a voice or a lyric stays with you long after the song ends. Damian and Deah left that behind, even if the world didn't notice right away. They may not have lived long enough to see how far their music traveled, but their influence is there, woven quietly into every harmony sung in the decades that followed. Because true art doesn't vanish when the lights go out. It waits patient, unhurried for the next generation to listen again. Time has a strange way of healing and revealing. For decades, Damian Dame's story remained buried beneath the louder success stories of their era. But as the years passed, people began to look back not just at the stars who filled arenas, but at those who built the stages they stood on. In recent years, music historians and R&B enthusiasts have started to revisit the roots of the LaFace sound. When documentaries or retrospectives mention the rise of Atlanta as the epicenter of 90-second soul, Damian Dame's name surfaces again, softly but unmistakably. Scholars call them the blueprint duo artists who defined a sound before the world was ready to hear it. Their story has also found a second life online. On YouTube, fan tributes and rare footage of their performances continue to attract comments from viewers who were there in 1991 and from younger listeners discovering them for the first time. Some write, "I can't believe I just found this. This is what real music sounds like." Others share memories of hearing Exclusivity at high school dances or in late-night radio shows that shaped their youth. It's not just nostalgia. It's recognition, a delayed but heartfelt acknowledgement that what they created mattered. In America, their rediscovery coincides with a larger cultural shift, a desire to honor those who contributed to the foundation of Black music, even if they didn't receive their flowers while alive. R&B podcasts, classic soul radio programs, and independent journalists have begun to tell their story again, framing Damian Dame not as a tragedy, but as a testament to artistic integrity. There's also growing appreciation abroad. In the United Kingdom and Japan, two countries known for their deep love of American R&B collectors and DJs, have long kept their records alive. Vinyl shops in Tokyo list their debut album among essential early 90 seconds grooves. British radio hosts include Right Down to It in curated playlists, celebrating lost soul duos of the decade. Even younger artists, raised in the digital age, cite Damian Dame as an influence. Some producers mention discovering their music while researching early LaFace productions. Others talk about how the blend of male-female energy in songs like Exclusivity inspired their approach to collaboration. And then there are the quiet tributes, the kind that don't make headlines but mean the most. Small-town open mics where singers cover Right Down to It. Church choirs that include snippets of Deah's melodies in gospel arrangements. Couples who choose Exclusivity as their wedding song decades later. Each one keeps their legacy alive in its own small, beautiful way. For the families and friends who knew them, these gestures mean everything. Many of them still live in Michigan and California, proud but private. They speak of Damian's humility, Deah's warmth, and how their story reminds people that greatness isn't measured by charts. It's measured by heart. In the end, The rediscovery of Damian Dame is less about fame and more about gratitude. Gratitude for what they gave and for what still remains. Their names may never headline music award ceremonies, but their sound continues to echo through time, like a faint melody carried by memory itself. When you listen closely, you realize that their story isn't about loss, it's about endurance, about how art, when made with love, never truly fades. They were the first to step into a dream called LaFace Records, and though the world moved on, their voices still hum in the background, soft, steady, eternal. Some stars shine for a lifetime, others for only a moment. But the light they leave behind can last forever. The story of Damian Dame doesn't end with loss, it ends with remembrance. Because somewhere, in every song they left behind, there's a heartbeat that never stopped. When Exclusivity plays today, it still feels like summer 1991, the sound of hope spinning through the air, the rhythm of two voices that believed in something bigger than fame. You can almost see them on stage again. Deah, poised and radiant, her voice carrying through the crowd, and Damian beside her, quiet but sure, keeping the groove steady beneath her melody. Two artists, perfectly balanced, completely alive. Time took them too soon, but time also gave them something rare, a kind of immortality that lives not in fame, but in feeling. Every listener who rediscovers them adds another spark to that light, keeping it from fading into silence. In the larger story of LaFace Records, their chapter is often small, almost overlooked. But without their faith, the label might never have become what it did. They were the foundation beneath the empire, the unseen architects of a sound that would carry R&B through the decade. Their journey short, imperfect, but deeply human reminds us why we fall in love with music in the first place. Because behind every beat, there's someone chasing a dream. Behind every voice, there's a life, fragile and real. Damian and Deah weren't just artists. They were dreamers who turned struggle into sound and heartbreak into harmony. In their brief time under the spotlight, they gave us a truth that outlasts success, that art made with honesty never dies. Maybe that's what the music of the past asks of us, not pity, but memory. To pause, to listen, to remember the names that history forgot. So tonight, if you find yourself scrolling through old playlists or sitting quietly with a favorite record, let their voices play one more time. Let the melody remind you that beauty doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers. Do you think the industry ever gave them the respect they truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help keep their light alive. Because remembering isn't just nostalgia, it's gratitude. It's how we make sure the artists who built our world are never lost to silence again. Some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.